I did not consider that the spirit of the depths from time immemorial and for all the future possesses a greater power than the spirit of this time, who changes with the generations. The spirit of the depths has subjugated all pride and arrogance to the power of judgment. He took away my belief in science, he robbed me of the joy of explaining and ordering things, and he let devotion to the ideals of this time die out in me. The spirit of this time whispered to me, this supreme meaning, this image of God, this melting together of the hot and the cold, that is you and only you. But the spirit of the depths spoke to me, you are an image of the unending world. All the last mysteries of becoming and passing away live in you. If you did not possess all this, how could you know? This quote by Carl Jung from the opening passage of the Red Book captures a most profound idea, that within the human being there exists two spirits. Firstly, one which is of a modern nature, civilized, developed, and of a so-called logic and rationality, and secondly, a deeper spirit that is of a more profound nature, which extends far into our past as a species and into the depths of our inner selves. It is this spirit of the depths, according to Jung, that sees meaning not as a purely subjective matter, but instead as a true image of the world. In other words, this spirit states that there is a nature of reality that aligns with meaning itself, as if it were an objective structure of the universe. Indeed, in all ages and times, there has persisted the suspicion that the world is not driven purely by natural law as we understand it, that there is something more, something deeper that also influences the passage of events in our world beyond causality. Most notably, when one examines the natural physical laws on the level of the very small, we find it to be only relatively, not absolutely accurate in predicting events, suggesting that there are indeed deeper forces at play in the causal process. In the words of Jung, the discoveries of modern physics have, as we know, brought about a significant change in our scientific picture of the world, in that they have shattered the absolute validity of natural law and made it relative. Natural laws are statistical truths, which means that they are completely valid only when we are dealing with macrophysical quantities. In the realm of the very small, prediction becomes uncertain, if not impossible, because very small quantities no longer behave in accordance with the known natural laws. The philosophical principle that underlies our conception of natural law is causality. But if the connection between cause and effect turns out to be only statistically valid and only relatively true, then the causal principle is only of relative use for explaining natural processes, and therefore presupposes the existence of one or more other factors which would be necessary for an explanation. As such, natural law is insufficient in explaining what causes events. Why? Because the natural law is not absolute. When we observe physical reality on a very small scale, many of the natural laws no longer hold true, meaning that it is, in fact, insufficient as an absolute explanation. However, this is not only true within the confines of experimental physics, it is also true in many peculiar experiences that occur in normal life. Experiences that don't make logical sense or appear to stand outside of natural law or causal probability. Jung called such experiences synchronicities and describes several experiences of this nature in his writings. One of the most striking examples he described went as follows. To quote, "By way of an example, I shall mention an incident from my own observation. A young woman which I was treating had, at a critical moment, a dream in which she was given a golden scarab. While she was telling me this dream, I sat with my back to the closed window. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, like a gentle tapping. I turned round and saw a flying insect knocking against the window pane from outside. I opened the window and caught the creature in the air as it flew in. It was the nearest analogy to a golden scarab that one finds in our latitudes, a scarabaeid beetle, the common rose chafer, or Setonia aurata, which, contrary to its usual habits, had evidently felt an urge to get into a dark room at this particular moment. This excerpt by Jung describes an event that is unlikely to occur by natural chance. That is, for the timing of a golden beetle flying into the room to coincide with the recollection of the dream involving a golden scarab. The only connection between the two events is the symbol of the golden scarab itself. But this begs the question, if not due to chance, why did the description of the dream and encounter with the physical beetle occur at the same point in time? Jung also mentions something quite interesting regarding this strange event. To quote, "It was an extraordinarily difficult case to treat, and up till the time of the dream little or no progress had been made. I should explain that the main reason for this was my patient's animus, which was steeped in Cartesian philosophy and clung so rigidly to its own idea of reality that the efforts of 3 doctors, I was the third, had not been able to weaken it. Evidently something quite irrational was needed which was beyond my powers to produce. The dream alone was enough to disturb ever so slightly the rationalistic attitude of my patient. But when the scarab came flying in through the window in actual fact, her natural being could burst through the armor of her animus possession, and the process of transformation could at last begin to move. Any essential change of attitude signifies a psychic renewal, which is usually accompanied by symbols of rebirth in the patient's dreams and fantasies. The scarab is a classic example of a rebirth symbol. The ancient Egyptian book of What is in the Netherworld describes how the dead sun god changes himself at the 10th station into Khepri, the scarab, and then at the 12th station mounts the barge which carries the rejuvenated sun god into the morning sky. In this passage, Jung is describing that this occurrence appeared to be connected by an archetypal meaning. The scarab showing up in the room shattered her animus possession and allowed her to experience a rebirth of character, and the scarab is an archetypal symbol of rebirth. Jung cited another example in his works that appears to match this pattern of symbolic meaning underlying the occurrence of synchronicities. In the words of Jung, "I should like to mention another case that is typical of a certain category of events. The wife of one of my patients, a man in his 50s, once told me in conversation that, at the deaths of her mother and her grandmother, a number of birds gathered outside the windows of the death chamber. I had heard similar stories from other people. When her husband's treatment was nearing its end, his neurosis having been cleared up, he developed some apparently quite innocuous symptoms, which seemed to me, however, to be those of heart disease. I sent him along to the specialist, who, after examining him, told me in writing that he could find no cause for anxiety. On the way back from this consultation, with the medical report still in his pocket, my patient collapsed in the street. As he was brought home, dying, his wife was already in a great state of anxiety because, soon after her husband had gone to the doctor, a whole flock of birds alighted on the house. She naturally remembered the similar incidents that had happened at the death of her own relatives, and feared the worst. If one considers that in the Babylonian Hades the souls wore a feather dress, and that in ancient Egypt the Ba, or soul, was thought of as a bird, it is not too far-fetched to suppose that there may be some archetypal symbolism at work. Had such an incident occurred in a dream, that interpretation would be justified by the comparative psychological material. As such, Jung points out a strange connection between the nature of these events and the presence of a corresponding archetypal symbol, in this case relating to death and birds. This is again suggesting the same thing, that archetypal meaning appears to be a characteristic of synchronicities. To quote Jung, "Meaningful coincidences therefore seem to rest on an archetypal foundation. At least all the cases in my experience, and there are a large number of them, show this characteristic." In his writings, Jung continued to describe many more examples of meaningful coincidences. A third example quoted by Jung from his own personal experience, relating this time to the symbol of the fish, went as follows. On April 1st, 1949, I made a note in the morning of an inscription containing a figure that was half man and half fish. There was fish for lunch. Somebody mentioned the custom of making an April fish of someone. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, whom I had not seen for months, showed me some impressive pictures of fish. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with sea monsters and fishes in it. The next morning, I saw a former patient who was visiting me for the first time in 10 years. She had dreamed of a large fish the night before. A few months later, when I was using this series for a larger work and had just finished writing it down, I walked over to a spot by the lake in front of the house, where I had already been several times that morning. This time, a fish a foot long lay on the sea wall. Since no one else was present, I have no idea how the fish could have got there. In this example, the same pattern presents itself. A connection of events not by any apparent causal process, but by a symbolic meaning, this time in the form of the fish. This line of bizarre experiences ultimately led Jung to propose that the nature of synchronicity may be a fundamental force of physical reality. Jung summarized this with Wolfgang von Pauli, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, in the following model, which includes synchronicity as a fourth fundamental property of physical reality. I should like to stop here and ask you to ponder this, because it is an incredibly potent concept. If true, it would suggest that somehow the human experience of meaning is descriptive not only of its own subjective experience, but also of an objective nature of the universe itself. Could synchronicities be the symptoms of a universe that has meaning as a property that is as fundamental as gravity or space-time? Of course, the prejudices of our time would laugh at the idea that personal meaning might relate to objective reality. Indeed, we have become so convinced that our material world is grounded on a cold causality detached from any sense of human meaning. But, to quote Jung, "When Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter with his telescope, he immediately came into a head-on collision with the prejudices of his learned contemporaries. Never before had anyone talked of the moons of Jupiter. Naturally, every age thinks that all ages before it were prejudiced, and today we think this more than ever and are just as wrong as all previous ages that thought so." As such, Jung's work suggests that acausal, synchronistic phenomena do exist, and secondly, that these phenomena are linked together by subjective human emotional charge according to archetypal meaning. This begs the question, why would synchronous events cluster around archetypal material? In attempting to answer this question, Jung cites several experiments completed by other researchers into the topic of parapsychology to further understand the phenomena of synchronicity. One such experiment he recounts was completed by a professor of psychology called J.B. Rhine, in which subjects were asked to guess a card that was lying face down. Jung describes this experiment and its results as follows. The experiment consists, in principle, in an experimenter turning up, one after another, a series of numbered cards bearing simple geometrical patterns. At the same time, the subject, separated by a screen from the experimenter, is given the task of guessing the signs as they are turned up. A pack of 25 cards is used, each 5 of which carry the same sign. The experimenter naturally does not know the order in which the pack is arranged, nor has the subject any opportunity for seeing the cards. Many of the experiments were negative, since the result did not exceed the probability of 5 chance hits. In the case of certain subjects, however, some results were distinctly above probability. The first series of experiments consisted in each subject trying to guess the card 800 times. The average result showed 6.5 hits for 25 cards, which is 1.5 times more than the chance probability of 5 hits. The probability there being a chance deviation of 1.5 from the number 5 works out at 1 to 250,000. This proportion shows that the probability of a chance deviation is not exactly high, since it is to be expected only once every 250,000 cases. One consistent experience in all these experiments is that the number of hits scored tends to sink after the first attempt, and the results then become negative. But if for some inner or outer reason there is a freshening of interest on the subject's part, the score rises again. Lack of interest and boredom are negative factors. Enthusiasm, positive expectation, hope, and belief in the possibility of ESP make for good results and seem to be real conditions which determine whether there are going to be any results at all. In this connection, it is interesting that the well-known English medium, Mrs. Eileen J. Garrett, achieved bad results in the Rhine experiment because she was unable to summon up any feeling for the soulless test cards. As such, the experiments conducted by J.B. Rhine suggested that emotional interest was a factor affecting whether positive results were achieved. However, there is no presence of any archetypes in these events. The cards hold little more than simple patterns, and as such, one cannot say that archetypal material is causing an effect. However, the number of correct card guesses were above chance probability. Because of this, Jung postulated that it was perhaps not archetypal symbology that caused this effect, but instead a certain kind of emotional interest that tended to be activated by the archetypes, which is to say, the experience of meaning. To quote, "Meaningful coincidences seem to rest on an archetypal foundation. At least all the cases in my experience, and there are a large number of them, show this characteristic. Although anyone with my experience in this field can easily recognize their archetypal character, he will find it difficult to link them up with the psychic conditions in Rhine's experiments, because the latter contain no direct evidence of any constellation of the archetype. Nor is the emotional situation the same as in my examples. Nevertheless, it must be remembered that with Rhine, the first series of experiments generally produced the best results, which then quickly fell off. But when it was possible to arouse a new interest in the essentially rather boring experiment, the results improved again. It follows from this that the emotional factor plays an important role. Affectivity, however, rests to a large extent on the instincts, whose formal aspect is the archetype. Thus, Jung suggests that a certain kind of emotional interest is key as a criterion for synchronous events, and this kind of emotion occurs with the experience of archetypal content. Jung also did note that apart from emotional interest, the occurrence of synchronicities and Rhine's experiments also shared another common factor: the conscious perception that the task was impossible. To quote, "There is yet another psychological analogy between my two cases and the Rhine experiments, though it is not quite so obvious. These apparently quite different situations have as their common characteristic an element of impossibility. The patient with the scarab found herself in an impossible situation because the treatment had got stuck and there seemed to be no way out of the impasse. In such situations, if they are serious enough, archetypal dreams are likely to occur which point out a possible line of advance one would never have thought of oneself. It is this kind of situation that constellates the archetype with the greatest regularity. In Ryan's card experiment, it is the impossibility of the task that ultimately fixes the subject's attention on the processes going on inside him, and thus gives the unconscious a chance to manifest itself. The questions set by the ESP experiment have an emotional effect right from the start, since they postulate something unknowable as being potentially knowable, and in that way take the possibility of a miracle seriously into account. This, regardless of the subject's skepticism, immediately appeals to his unconscious readiness to witness a miracle, and to the hope latent in all men that such a thing may yet be possible. Primitive superstition lies just below the surface of even the most tough-minded individuals, and it is precisely those that fight against it who are the first to succumb to its suggestive effects. When, therefore, a serious experiment with all the authority of science behind it touches this readiness, it will inevitably give rise to an emotion which either accepts or rejects it with a good deal of affectivity. At all events, an affective expectation is present in one form or another, even though it may be denied. Jung suggests, therefore, that one of the common factors between synchronous events and Ryan's card experiments was the perception that the task or event was impossible, which, in turn, gave rise to an affective experience of emotion. In summary, then, Jung argues that this perception of impossibility, together with the presence of a special emotional charge relating to meaning, forms the two basic properties of acausal events and synchronicities. It is here that I would like to pause and introduce an idea to you. Is it not the case that following your soul fulfills the two prerequisites of synchronistic acausal phenomena to the highest degree? The soul, in the Jungian context, rarely just means the nature of true meaning and life within us. What does it mean to follow one's soul? It means to pursue meaning over the world. It means to live according to what fills your being with life and purpose, as opposed to living according to fear, obligation, insecurity, and self-doubt. To follow one's soul is to choose the reality of the inner world over the threat of the outer world. Naturally, on the path of following one's soul, one will immediately come face to face with the threats of fear, doubt, and false logic, often making the path of following one's soul appear impossible or difficult, at least to our limited ego. But if we were to choose to listen to our soul and act out its guidance when it appears as impossible to do so, would that not fulfill the second criteria of synchronicity? Following our soul and the true self is both charged with an exceptional emotional content of meaning, and is also often perceived as impossible to do in the face of natural law. Could it be that we have been created in such a manner that when we submit ourselves to the will of our souls, even in the apparent face of impossibility, physical reality changes in an acausal, synchronous way? If this is true, then it challenges the most basic assumptions we have of the nature of life itself and what it means to be a human being. If it is rarely the case that meaning describes a fundamental property of the universe, and that the most potent way to activate this synchronistic phenomena is to follow the experience of meaning, then it may be the case that if you want to have true well-being in your life, with a job you love and a partner you are deeply connected to, following your soul may be the only true way to achieve that. Of course, the vital and primary reason to do this is because it leads you to true wholeness, balance, and spiritual maturity, independent of the external world. But if the phenomenon of synchronicity is true, it may actually lead also to the literal physical change of the world in your favor. But if it is the soul that is the ultimate authority as to whether life is even worth living at all, if it is the soul that fills man with passion, truth, vitality, and love, and if it is the soul that coordinates the universe itself to bring about the object of its desire through the mechanisms of synchronicity, then perhaps the single and most absolute task man has in this life is to surrender his being, his will, and his mind most utterly to the demands and nature of meaning within him. That is to say, he must follow his soul, and in doing so, the universe itself will move with him.